I didn't send him to school simply because I don't think it would have been right for him.
Hmm.
Um,
Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to another episode of Parenthood. I'm your host, Neha, and this is the space where we celebrate the stories of real parents, the unpolished, beautiful, sometimes messy, but always meaningful stories that make up the heart of parenting. Today's episode is one I've been looking forward to because we are joined by someone whose writing lingers long after the last page and whose parenting journey is as thoughtful and lyrical as her prose. My guest today is Dharini Bhaskar. If you've read her debut novel, These Are Bodies Possessed by Light, shortlisted for the JCB Prize for Literature, you already know how deftly Dharini navigates memory, relationships, and the quiet, complex lives of women. Her second novel, Like Being Alive Twice, released this year, is a stunning exploration of love, choice, and the echoes of our times, blending speculative and deeply intimate narratives. But beyond the awards and the critical acclaim, what strikes me most about Dharini is her ability to carry gentleness and fire together as both a writer and a mother. Dharini often says she is being brought up by her son, and in that simple phrase lies the honesty and humility of parenting that we love to talk about here on Parenthood. In this episode, we are diving into her homeschooling journey, her approach to attachment parenting, the realities of breastfeeding and full time creative work, and how motherhood has reshaped her writing and the way she inhabits the world. So let's begin. Dharini, welcome to Parenthood. I'm just so delighted to have you here today.
and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for organizing this and for inviting me and for discussing something that I think is so closely linked to my writing life, which is my relationship with my child and the daily relationship that's nurtured and that we grow together.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we get into your relationship with your child, I love to talk about you. You are a writer. I love imagining our lives as storybooks. So if your life was a book, what would say its title be, and which chapter are you currently living in?
Titles and I have a fairly fraught relationship. It takes me a very, very, very long time to come up with the title for anything. Um, so I'm not going to offer a title for a book on my life simply because it'll possibly take me a few decades to come up with that. But what I can tell you is which chapter of my life am I in now? I I I actually am in a place right now where things could take any direction. So
Mhm.
I would like to think that I'm at a crossroads, but then aren't we always at a crossroads? At some level, we are always at this point where things can go this way or that. And that moment is always the moment we inhabit. So to that extent, I think when I say I'm at a crossroads, I mean I'm pretty much living in the present moment.
Wow. Wow, how beautiful. And tell me, Dharini, now coming to you've spoken about being brought up by your son, which I mean, I find it such a beautiful, subversive way of looking at parenting also. Can you tell us a little bit about your son and what he is like?
When I say brought up by my son, I'm glad you mentioned that only because I genuinely believe that it's a relationship, and I truly believe this is true for parenting, that it's one where the work has to be done by us, the parents, that very often we place the onus on children, they have to be of a certain kind, but really it's on us. We have to heal our wounds. We have to deal with our triggers. We have to engage with our past in a constructive way so that we can parent our children. So I think parenting really is a journey of remaking ourselves.
Yeah.
And which is why I keep saying I'm being brought up by my son because I feel that what he's doing just through his presence. And
Mm.
I don't think his presence is any different from the presence of any child, but just by being around, he's making me reassess my understanding of myself, my understanding of the world and my engagement with it.
Yeah.
And he's also, I think he's making me become a better version of me. I would like to believe that. So I'm very much work in progress, but I feel that just through his presence, he's helping me on a journey that I should be on, where I try becoming a better human being.
Wow. Wow. And so that, what does being a mother mean to you? Not just in biological or social sense, but also in your personal vocabulary. You've spoken so much about, these changes and transformation and evolution. So what does it mean to you?
I think, and I would say this, in fact, I would dispute the idea that motherhood is biological, simply because I think that you can be a parent without necessarily giving birth to a child. You can be a parent without necessarily having a part of your genetic makeup in a baby. So I would absolutely say parenting does not have to be biological. What I would say is parenting is meant to be transformative, and we need to be open to that. I think more than anything else, motherhood, parenting, this journey asks for openness and being really receptive to what our children are telling us, because it's not always what we imagined it would be. Very often, what they're communicating is very different from, say, the world we imagined before they came into the world. But I think as long as we remain open and receptive, it's a journey that is enriching for both of us. So for me, motherhood is really about openness. I think that has been, for me, my greatest discovery, that I'm as good a parent as I'm open to what's being communicated by my child.
Wow, wow, that's such a a kind of ownership. You've taken such a good ownership of this whole process, and there's such a nice way of looking at it. And I want to rewind a little. Tell us about, how your journey into motherhood began. What were those few days, first few days or months like for you?
Oh gosh, it was one of the most challenging of phases. And I think this is true for all new mothers, whether or not we articulate it, because culturally we are always told that we slip easily into motherhood, that it is something that comes naturally to us. And it actually isn't that simple, especially in the times we live in,
Yeah.
given the fact that we don't actually have an extended tribe to lean on. We are pretty much on our own with our children. And so it becomes so much harder, so much more daunting. And I think for me, besides the euphoria, of the early moments, I think for me, the overwhelming sense was, that of responsibility, pressing responsibility, and also the fear that I don't really know my way around this and I
Yeah.
have to figure it out. So there's this deep sense of unknowing. You're responsible for this beautiful, fragile being, and you have to keep them physically whole, psychologically whole, and keep yourself psychologically whole and physically able as well. And for the early weeks and months, it feels like such a huge demand, and it feels very often overwhelming. And I think that I think that would really be the feeling that really took over for the early months. The sense, this crushing sense of how am I going to do it?
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of people have a lot of coping mechanisms, and each person has his own way of dealing with this, walking through this tunnel. For me, I think my coping mechanism has always been reading.
Mm-hmm.
So it's what I turn to when I'm scared, lost, unsure, confused, overwhelmed, and even when I'm not, but especially, when things seem a bit dark and blurry, I turn to books. And so, what I found myself doing also in the early weeks and months, and pretty much for the first 3 or 4 years of my son's life, I read extensively in the space of parenting. So for me, it was my anchor, such reading, because it gave me clarity when I wasn't sure. And it also validated my instincts, because
Right.
we live in a world with so much noise and so many people telling us contrary things that we no longer know what our instincts are telling us and whether we can trust it. And so, more than anything else, I think what the reading I did was this: it led me back to my instincts, and it reminded me that I could trust my instincts, that my instincts were my best guides. And for me, that was really important at that point, and even today. But I think it's all the extensive. So I literally spent a major part of, whenever my son was napping, whenever he was asleep, I would be reading up on the space. I even did I am a big follower of a psychologist, a child psychologist named Gordon Neufeld. And I remember doing courses at the Neufeld Institute, and just trying to gain as much knowledge as I could, partly because I found the space fascinating, but also so I could find my way back to my instincts.
Wow. Wow. And I'm so glad you brought it up because your approach to parenting seems so intuitive from, the little that I know. I know you practice attachment parenting, and you've had maybe an extended breastfeeding journey. So all of this seems so intuitive, but I'm so glad that you pointed out that, the reading guided you back to your instincts. That's such a beautiful way of realizing and also putting it up in that sense. Could you share what drew you to this style, and how it has shaped your bonding with your son?
So, to begin with, I didn't have an approach. And even today, I wouldn't necessarily say so. I call it attachment parenting simply for ease of communication.
Yeah.
But there is very often attachment parenting comes with this burden of, being a very strict path where you have to choose one
Right.
way of parenting, or, you're off the path. And I I I would dispute that simply because we live in times and we live in circumstances where it's not always possible to, align yourself with necessarily one school of parenting
Yeah.
over all others. I think we have to also work with situations that aren't necessarily conducive, and we have to acknowledge them and we have to work around them. So while I would call it attachment parenting at one level, I would also say that it's really responsive parenting. It's being
Right.
aware of what your child is saying, being aware also of your own constraints, because we all come with, very many constraints, and we are all battling so many pressures on a day-to-day basis. Acknowledging that, acknowledging what a child is saying, and then finding a way of, working through this. So for me, when I started out, what appealed most to me, the more I read and the more I engaged with the space, was that parenting can be a battle. We can make it a battle where, it's a battle of wills, where we decide what the child is meant to do, and we communicate that in a very firm way to the child, and the child has to follow. And so it
Right.
follows this top-down approach where we know and the child doesn't, and the child has to follow what we say. And very often what happens then is it becomes, this constant everyday tussle. So I realized that to nurture a relationship, I had to be open to what was being communicated and pivot when I had to. And also know that I don't always have the answers. And very often, our children, as these beautiful biological beings that come into the world, they very often know what their needs are. And
Right.
as long as I recognize what they are saying, and I have the ability to meet that need, I mean, not always, but to whatever extent possible, if I can, we are in a relationship. Then it's no longer then, this autocratic approach where parent knows and child follows, but it's a relationship. And I think more than anything else, that has been my focus, keeping this a relationship.
Yeah. I'm I'm surprised that you thought so much about it. Like, sometimes we just go about this journey, as we are, like without thinking, without giving it much structure and I'm just very, very surprised, pleasantly surprised that you've given it so much thought, you've given it so much background material, to equip yourself to say that this is for me and this is not for me. Oh, and what I'm also very, very curious about is your homeschooling journey, Dharini. What made you choose homeschooling, and what does a typical day look like for you and your son?
So I homeschool, yes, and it was a decision that I didn't when I gave birth to my son, that wasn't the path I was on necessarily. But the more I tuned into him and the more I was listening, just simply
Yeah.
listening to what he was saying, the more I came to realize that I wasn't committed to the idea of necessarily sending him, especially in the early years. I wasn't committed to the idea of sending him to formal school.
Mm.
And I use the word early years, especially because I think that, especially in the early years, it's if the option exists, and that's the other caveat. It doesn't always exist, and we need to acknowledge the fact that it's not always open to all of us. And there are economic pressures. There are so many other pressures that are operating at any given moment that we can't always, even if we ideologically align with a certain
Yeah.
path, we can't always take it.
Yeah.
But all that told, I felt that in the circumstances I was in, for me, this made sense, especially given what my child seemed to be communicating as he was growing up. I did a lot of my reading in the early weeks and months also led me to other books that engaged with the space. And the more I read about it, the more I felt very committed to the idea of simply releasing him from the expectation of going down the schooling path, because very often it can feel a bit like an expectation. So I said, what if I released him, and what if he happened to be a free being? How would that work? And I really valued the early years. The first so I started working full time when my son turned 6,
Wow.
and by then he was old enough to sort of slip into this new life where I was working full time, but he was very much, I work from home, so he was very much around as a presence. I was there as a presence, but I had spent the first 6 years basically laying the foundation so
Yeah.
that I could get the attachment relationship in place. But I really value that time, and I'm also personally glad that I didn't send him to school, simply because I don't think it would have been right for him.
Hmm.
So when people ask me why I homeschool, I very often flip the question over and say, why are we sending a child to school, especially in the early years? And typically the answers that are offered have to do, and I'll list some of them out. So it has to do with, how will he learn,
Hmm.
right? If he doesn't go to school, that's the first question. The next one is, how will he be socialized? How will he become a creature of the world? That's the second question. Then what I'm often told is the child needs to know courage and independence. And if we don't send the child to school, how will he know courage and independence? There's also the belief that he won't find his way later in life. That, if you have to climb the career ladder, or if you need to become successful, quote unquote,
Yeah.
how will you do that without, the backing of a school? And I think one other concern, of course, which I think is actually, for me, it is the most significant of concerns, is how can I homeschool if I'm working,
Hmm.
right? So, and for me, that is actually the foundational question, because
Yeah.
it is a very valid concern. And for me, the other concerns really to do with learning, to do with socialization, are those that can be addressed simply because there's enough literature today to remind us that the questions are built on flawed assumptions.
Hmm.
uh, I don't know if you want me to get into this for 2 or 3.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Please. Yes.
Okay, so I'll just approach one question which has to do with my child will not know courage and independence if he's
Yeah.
not sent to school in the early years. And it was something that I did think about. And then I was doing, like I said, I was doing these courses at the Newfeld Institute. And that's when I made some very interesting discoveries. And these are things that we aren't told
Hmm.
about. The mind of a child, the brain of a child is biologically very different from, say, that of an adult. The
Hmm.
brain keeps growing, of course, until a certain age. But at the age of 3, 4, and 5, we are dealing with a being whose brain functioning we need to be aware of. So when we say the child should know courage, right? What we're not aware of is that courage is actually a mixed emotion. What
Hmm.
do I mean by that? What does it mean to be courageous? It means to hold desire in one hand and to hold alarm or fear in the other. So
Wow.
want suppose I want an ice cream, right? That is desire. But there is no fear or alarm attached to it. So buying an ice cream is not an act of courage. Now suppose I'm scared of the dark, right?
Hmm.
I have no reason to step out of my house at night, let's assume. So there is fear, there's alarm, but I don't need to act on the alarm. So being scared of darkness is not an act of courage either. Now, suppose I want an ice cream in the middle of the night. Suppose to get that ice cream, I have to walk through a forest, and there's a shop at the other end. I have to walk through a dark forest. There is desire for an ice cream.
Hmm.
There is fear, genuine fear about the dark. And when fear and desire collide, when we find a way of acknowledging both those feelings and working through them, that's when we know courage. So
Wow.
if I manage to walk through the forest at night, if I get the ice cream, come back home and have it, at that point, getting an ice cream is an act of courage because
That's
I've known fear and I've known desire. Now, because that's why I call it a mixed feeling, because it has two emotions, two feelings at once that are in conversation. Now, until the age of 5, sometimes even 6, our children can't know mixed feelings. It's a neurological impossibility. Their brains are still developing. They're what we call immature brains.
right.
So they can't know. Yeah, childhood is beautiful for this reason, the early years, because it's the only time in life when we will know unadulterated feelings. So if it's joy, it's 100% joy. If it's fear, it's absolute terror. It's never mixed because children can't hold two feelings at once. So it's always one feeling or another. They can
Yeah.
cycle from feeling to feeling, but it's one feeling in its entirety. Growing up, becoming adults is actually becoming creatures of mixed feelings.
Hmm.
And if we give children the space to know mixed feelings early, that's when they become adults who can actually hold two feelings at once. A lot of adults even now struggle with it simply because we haven't been given space as children to know our feelings, to work through them.
Right.
But the function of mixed feelings is one that kids under the age of 4, 5, the trajectory varies, but early years they can't have it. So when we tell
Hmm.
a child you have to go to school because you have to be courageous, we're making a demand that is a neurologically flawed demand, because it's like telling a monkey you have to fly. The
Yeah.
monkey can't fly. The child can't be courageous because he can't hold mixed feelings. What he
Right.
can know is fear. What he can know is alarm. Or what he can know is joy. But he can't hold, the emotion of courage. So if he can't know courage, we can't ask him to show courage by going to school. It's not something he's capable of at that age. What he
Right.
can, what he's capable of showing is resistance, which comes from fear.
Yeah.
And when we talk about independence, I always say secure dependence alone brings independence. So if a child is
Yeah.
secure in his dependence, and he has to be dependent, and he has to know security in such dependence, only then can he take that flight to independence.
Absolutely.
So which is why, that's just one argument that's given, for sending kids to school. And I feel that when we understand the neurological basis of these arguments and the fact that very often we're making flawed assumptions, the
Hmm.
arguments themselves crumble. And if the
Right.
arguments crumble, then we no longer have a reason really to pursue a certain path. So for me, I found that all the arguments I was thinking of vis-a-vis schooling, they were crumbling around me, because especially if I was studying the childhood brain, the two weren't compatible. The way the child's brain works, the way it's wired, and the way modern day schooling works.
Right.
There are schools that are exceptions. There are centers, especially I've seen this happening in certain parts of the world, harder in India. I mean, it exists, but it's harder to find. But there are centers that are conducive. But even so, I'd say in the early years, if the option exists, it's
Hmm.
an option worth considering. Whether you just keep the child, around you at home, because everything he needs to learn is happening in your company, and
Yeah.
it's happening through your presence, and that's all the child needs. And it's actually so simple sometimes, because we complicate things by saying, oh, this has to happen, and this is the trajectory a child has to
Yeah.
follow. We often make things very complicated, but it can in fact be quite straightforward and simple.
And you were also talking about the foundational question about, how to do it with full-time work, or how to do it by yourself when you are not an educator. Those kind of questions. How did you deal with those?
So I think it's very, very hard. I'll be honest. I think it's very hard to hold a full-time job in the early years and also be there for the child as a parent who is engaging constantly.
Right.
It's difficult. I think after the age of 5, I would even say 6 or 7, it becomes a little easier. And the reason I say this is because your child is slightly less dependent on you physically and emotionally. He's still very anchored to, he's dependent on your presence, but I think a little less so. And I would also say that it becomes a little easier at the age of 6 and 7, because if you're lucky, a child will be moving towards independent reading at around this point. There isn't a definite age. So, from what I understand, if reading is not imposed, if the child is simply left to his devices, they can come into reading any time between 6 and 11. So that's a
Mm.
very vast age range. And so I won't say that, a 6-year-old necessarily has to read. He may not. There are children who even start reading later, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Um, but once a child starts reading independently, I feel, especially if he's taking to books, it becomes easier, because then you're working and your child is reading.
Yeah.
And for me, my move towards work full time coincided with my child's movement towards independent
Mm.
reading. So
Um,
the two happened in parallel. So it made it a little. I won't say it's easy, but
mm.
it's made it a little more straightforward. But until the age of until that happens, and I would even say until the age of 6, it's so difficult to be a full-time parent and be a full-time employee, or work full-time. There are people who find ways around it.
Yeah.
A lot also depends on whether you have structures in place. Suppose you have a really good nanny, for instance, to help with child care responsibilities. If you have a community around you that you can lean on, there are lots of variable factors that can facilitate, say, not sending a child to school, being a homeschooling parent, and a working parent. But I will say it's challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. And talking
Yeah.
about
And
that.
I think it's
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
No, I was saying it's important to acknowledge this and not feel guilty about not making certain life choices, because we need to be aware of the fact that we live in a culture that does not make parenting easy. In fact, the culture does the opposite. It makes
Yes.
it as hard as possible.
Yeah.
And so, if we realize that we are living in a world that is not geared towards making parenting straightforward, then we be kinder to ourselves. It's okay if we can't do the things that we may have liked to do as parents simply because we don't have the ability, the means, the option available, and that's fine. We are trying our best.
Yeah, yeah. And that also brings me to my next question about, you managing your time and your life in a way that you're able to do what you want to do, and you also while being present for your son, as you want to be. So how do you do that? How do you manage your time? How do you do what you do without feeling stretched too thin day after day, every day?
I think you do feel stretched too thin day after day. I don't think there's any way of escaping that unless you have, like I say, you have a tribe to lean on.
Mm.
There's absolutely no way out of this. I mean, either you don't have the economic independence you might need, or you sacrifice something else, but it's impossible to hold all these lives together without feeling stretched. I think it's just a fact of life, and it is especially true for women,
Mm.
because I do think that the demands made on women are huge, enormous, and the judgments passed are also huge and very often damaging. So I would say it's really hard for a mother, especially. I think we are far kinder to men and we are far harsher when it concerns women. A mother's always up for judgment.
Yeah,
Her decisions are always up for scrutiny, and nothing she does will ever be right.
yeah,
So these are facts we live with. And so what I would say, in fact, I would say that to be an effective parent, the first rule is we have to be kind to ourselves.
yeah,
Let's be forgiving of everything that is going wrong at every given moment, because 100 things are going wrong. We are stretched. We have 10 demands being made on us at any given moment.
yeah,
And that's the way we live. And I don't see a way out of this unless, as a world, we shift the way we view parenting. If
yeah,
parenting becomes central to, say, the way we build a world,
yeah.
if childhood becomes central to the way we build a world, then we possibly will see a situation emerge where parents have options,
Mm-hmm.
where children can have the kind of life that is more aligned with the way they are biologically wired. But
Right.
we don't have that world, and we aren't even inching towards that world. We are going in the opposite direction.
Yes.
So once we realize that, I would say that we keep the focus, one where we do the best that we can,
Yeah.
with the tools that we have. And there's no escaping being stretched. I think being stretched is the way it goes. Sleep deprivation is the way it goes. Trying to juggle 20 things is pretty much the way it goes. Even if, and I often find it very surprising when people say, oh, she's just a stay-at-home mother,
Yeah.
because I think a stay-at-home mother is juggling so much. I
Mm.
mean, she's juggling as much as I am, as someone, with a child working full time. I don't think the load on her is less than the load that I'm carrying. And so I would say that even if your life choice is to stay at home, it's still a full time job, and
Yeah.
it's still very demanding. And worse still, it does not come with the remuneration that it should. And so there isn't even, the economic respect it should be getting. So it's actually a situation that puts a woman in a very uncomfortable place. But I would say it's a full time job, and it's a backbreaking job. And so I don't think there is any woman out there, and even if she doesn't have a child, I don't think there is a single woman out there who's not carrying more than her fair share of, load.
That's, yeah, thank you for saying that. And talking about the backbreaking nature of this job, I want to know what has been some of, or maybe one of the most challenging moments for you as a parent so far, and how did you navigate through it? What
I think
what was it like?
I think for me, the thing that I found hardest to wrap my head around, and I think this has a lot to do with the idealism with which we bring children into the world. And not everyone may be equally idealistic, but I think somewhere in all of us there's a germ of idealism
Yeah,
and maybe also hubris. I I can keep my child uh, safe from everything.
yeah.
And the fact is that when they emerge in the world, they emerge into joy, but they also emerge, they are also beings who will know sorrow, who will know disappointment. And you can be there for them, but you can't keep them away from it. It's something that they will walk through at various points, even when you try your best to keep them away from it. And I think for me, that has been the hardest thing to wrap my head around, the fact that even with my best efforts, he will know pain. He
Oh,
will know physical pain. He will know emotional pain.
mm,
And I can try my best to be there as a presence, but I can't take away the pain from him. This is the human condition. And for me, it's been, I mean, at a logical level, it shouldn't have been hard to come to terms because we all know this is the human
yeah,
condition. And
yeah,
yet I think at some level we think we can keep our children safe,
yeah.
but we can't. And again and again life will remind you that you can't,
Mm.
and that very often you have to make choices and decisions that may cause them pain, and it's keeping their interest central, and yet making these decisions, and yet knowing that pain is an inevitability sometimes. And I think it's something that I know I struggled and I still struggle with a lot. And maybe the challenges for others are different. For me,
Yeah,
this has
yeah.
been something I struggled with.
Yeah. And on that note, I also want to know what has been one of the seemingly ordinary parenting moment that left a big impact on you.
Um, I this comes back to me only because I think I was talking about mixed feelings and mixed emotions,
Yeah.
and so it came back to me simply when I was talking about that because I remember when my son was about 4, and I was deep into all of this and just reading about all of this, and when he was 4, he I was visiting my mother, and my mother was telling him to clean up his mess in the room, and he looked at her and he told her, I love you, but I don't like it when you keep asking me to clean the room. And I almost screamed in joy. I said, oh my God, he's coming into mixed feelings. This is a neurological milestone. He can hold love and irritation together. And
Oh,
it was like this big aha moment. Oh my God, and it was also a slightly heartbreaking moment because I realized now he's moving away from the kingdom of childhood where, feelings are pure. He's
yeah.
moving into a state where they're getting more muddied, more mixed. And that's where most of us are. But it was a big aha moment. And the other thing, so I love reading in the space also because things that might otherwise miss us suddenly
Mhm.
leap out for
Yeah.
me. So I remember there was so one of the things that we talk about when we talk about attachment is there are various stages it goes through, and the idea is that as the child grows, and when I'm talking about growth, I'm talking about 0 to 6 or 7. As he matures, the attachment deepens,
Right.
and there was this point when the attachment is deepening when they literally give their heart to you, where they say that you are my beloved. And every child goes through this phase where, the parent is beloved. It might be this brief flicker of a moment,
Yeah.
but there is this time, and we all look back on it with nostalgia, right? Oh my God, I was my child's world for this point in time. And so when they give their heart to you, very often they sometimes do it in ways that are so obvious and so beautiful. Like I remember my son, when he was going through this phase, he would go to we visit craft stores basically to buy craft supplies so we could work together with crafts. And he'd go to the craft store and he'd look for all the hearts in the store, and he'd buy a pile of hearts, and he would say, can I want to give this to you.
Oh,
And I realized that that's such, these are moments, and these are moments that tell us so much about our children literally giving their hearts to us and to pass and to become other things.
yeah.
But that moment is sacred.
Yeah.
And so, these are moments I really cherish. I cherish them because of their inherent beauty, but I also cherish them because of what they're telling me about, the journey my child is on, the attachment journey. And I find that I find it so fascinating as an onlooker.
Yeah, yeah. And as a person who is on this journey with him, do you find that your parenting choices, like homeschooling and, you're talking about attachment parenting, influence the way you write or create?
I think so. I think it has had, this has always been, at some level, I think I've always been inclined this
Mhm.
way. Right? That's why, when I read books that spoke to me, they were
Yeah,
reminding me of the path I'm anyway on. So at some level, this was always something that I was veering towards without necessarily knowing that I was. But I think what it has made me understand is the value of kindness and gentleness.
mm,
And I hope that comes through in my choice of words, in my writing as well. The underlying principle, I can be critical of a character at some level. I can have sharp observations about them, but I can also keep that kernel of kindness alive. I think that for me has been seminal. The fact that I remember
yeah,
uh, kindness,
yeah,
and that even when I approach writing as a craft, I need to be kind to myself.
yeah,
But also when I'm working with words, I need to work with words with kindness, so that that core of kindness comes through, or an awareness, empathy. I think that is something that I hope my writing conveys, because what values human life, or is our life on this planet, if we can't be empathetic? And so I hope that empathy shines through in what I write, because that really has been my parenting journey, listening and trying to, I may not always be successful, but really trying to be empathetic.
yeah, yeah. And I also want to know, Dharini, that has motherhood changed your relationship with your own mother? And as you talk about the mother in your lineage.
I'm glad you asked that. So actually, when I started, the person who introduced me to my first parenting book was my mother. When I was pregnant, she gave me a book called The Continuum Concept, and she said it changed her life. So I read it, and it at that moment, it really, at that, I think it's about the book arriving at the right moment. I don't know if it would speak to me in exactly the same way today, but back then it did, and it led me to other books in this space. So, in many ways, she has been the catalyst, because she gave me the book that started me on my reading journey in this space. But I think what has also happened, and I think this is true for all of us who become mothers, we are more forgiving of our parents
Yeah,
once we become parents. I think as teenagers we are so full of judgment, and we are so quick to point out errors, missteps, things we don't like about them, point out the bad life choices they made, and make a joke out of it. We are so quick to do all of that, and then we become parents, and we realize what a struggle it can be on an hourly basis. And I think we begin to respect and have high regard for the things they did, that they
yeah,
really, with the tools they had, they did
yeah,
the best that they could.
yeah,
And we are not talking about perfection, because none of us is going to be a perfect parent. We are going to make 100, I wouldn't even call them mistakes. We are just going to be figuring things out. And
Yeah.
they figured it out as best as they could with the tools they had. So I think forgiveness and understanding and empathy, I think those become the governing note that
Yeah.
governs our interactions with our parents. I think after we have children, I think we become different children.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad you talked about that because I have been very interested to know, do you ever catch glimpses of the child you were or the girl you were in your son, when you see him growing up?
All the time, and I have to keep stopping myself because at some level he's his own person, and I don't want to I don't want to keep seeing myself as a child in him. But there are, oh my god, there are so many moments when I feel like I'm looking at a much younger version of myself, especially when he loves reading,
Yeah.
and one of his joys in life is simply to sit in a corner and read. And so when I
Wow.
see reading, it reminds me of my childhood because that used to be my prime passion as well, to read. And I feel that there is that conversation between my younger self and his present self happening all the time when I see him read. And it brings me, yeah, it makes me very nostalgic. But he also does things that I never did. Like he loves playing the ukulele. He
Yeah.
loves music. And for me, as much as I like being a listener of music, I was never invested in, actually pursuing it as a creator, as an
Mm.
artist. And that's something that's a quality he's displaying. And so I feel he's also his own, he's on his own path. When he was younger, he was deeply invested in cars. That has nothing to do with me, absolutely. I wouldn't know one car from another. Though I started learning about cars after he started showing interest, purely so I could keep the conversation going and I could keep pace. But I don't. Otherwise I have no interest in them. And he was deeply invested until he lost interest. So I think he's doing his own things. But there are stark similarities that come through sometimes, and I think we all look for these as parents,
Yeah.
and then our children are very quick to remind us that they are nothing like us.
Yeah, yeah. And also, one of the questions that I've always wanted to ask all the parents that I talk with is that how has parenting changed your relationship with time? Do you ever struggle to carve time for yourself just as Dharini, not as the author, the mother, the educator, but simply as you?
No. The honest answer to that is no, because I pretty much, the three most important pursuits in my life right now are my son, and my writing, and there is my commitment to my work as well.
Mm.
And with these three pretty much full-time jobs,
Yeah.
I don't find a moment for anything else. That those moments existed in the past, and I believe they will come back to me as my son grows older.
Yeah.
But at the present moment, no. And I think when it concerns my relationship with time, it's transformed completely after being a parent. My relationship with both time and space, the
Mm.
idea of my own space no longer exists. And in the past, I would often say, before I had my child, I have a corner in which I will write. It's my desk, it's my writing corner, and nobody's allowed there when I'm writing, simply because it's my sacred space at that moment. And I have fixed hours and I appear, whether or not I write, I appear. And then you have a child, and suddenly that idea of space is gone. They're attached to you, they're on your body, they are a part of your life, they are everywhere where you are. And so I actually no longer even have a writing desk. I write wherever, and my son is very often somewhere around. You might have seen him, peeking into this video at one point. He's everywhere, and he's part of, my meetings. He's part of my life. And And so I don't have a space. So your idea of space shifts with the child simply because until they grow older and they claim their own space, uh, they are a part of your life. They are woven in, and they are there. So there's no space and time. Time is what you carve out after everything else is done, and nothing is ever done.
Yeah.
So there is no time.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And finally, one last question I have for you. If you had to leave our listeners, especially other parents who may be in the thick of sleepless nights or impossible balancing acts, with one thought, one piece of advice or reassurance, what would that be?
I would say it'll pass, but it doesn't feel like that when you're in the moment. And sleep deprivation does very strange things to the brain. It makes everything feel endless, and you can't surmount it. So, while it's very nice for me to say it'll pass, it's not going to feel genuine at all when you are in the middle of it. What I would say is be gentle with yourself. I think that's really my only advice. If I'm in no place to give advice, but the only thing I would tell anyone who's new to motherhood or even later in life, be as gentle with yourself as possible, because there'll be enough people pointing fingers. So be kind. And I think when you're kind to yourself, that kindness sort of radiates and becomes part of your child's world and becomes part of the larger world. But I would say, as a tenet, uh, be kind to yourself when you are a new parent, because you're doing a lot. You're doing more than you should,
Yeah.
and you're doing it under circumstances that are killing. So so it's okay if you've had a bad day and you haven't been what you wanted to be. It's okay. Tomorrow is another day to catch up and to revise. So so I think just gentleness with oneself is what I would recommend, because that's the only thing that will see you through.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, how
Yeah.
profound. Thank you. Thank you, Dharini, for being here and for letting us glimpse this side of you, not just as a brilliant writer, but also as a mother who's creating her own paths with such grace and thoughtfulness, I would say. And I
Thank
think
you.
your words, both on the page and in live, they feel like an invitation to slow down and listen to, listen to our child, to our stories, to ourselves. It's just so, you have used that word and I'm going to borrow that from you. It's very instinctive, and how attuned we are to our instinct, just just doing that. And as you said, we'll be fine. Thank you for showing up.
No, thank you for having me and for being here and just listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for another episode of Parenthood. If Dharani's journey resonated with you, please share this episode with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and join our growing community of parents who believe in honest, unfiltered conversations. Until next time, this is Neha signing off. Thank you. Bye bye.